Now what does this change about our CSS? So now instead of using an h2 for a selector, we can now use the class stacked hero section title. Let's do that. So I'll copy the class name. Let's paste it over here. We'll add the dot to make it a class selector. Now we can also change where we use an h2 tag here and here. So this h2 is inside of a section with the class different, which is right here. So we're going to use the same class here, stacked hero section title. I'll paste it in and add the dot. And then finally we have this h2, which is inside of our slide class. It now has a class of slide-title. So let's copy this and we'll put it in here with the dot. Now let's save this and jump back to our browser and take a look at what this changes. So for the most part, everything stayed the same, but we do see a bit of a change in this heading here. If we go back to our code, we can see why. Before, our styles started cascading from here because these styles applied to an h2 tag directly. So while there was a lot that we were overriding, there was at least one example of a style that we would have changed in our other heading anyway. I'm going to close this out so we can look at this side by side with the output here. So for example, we're using the sans serif font with these headings, and we want that here as well, but now it's not cascading. So let's copy this style and paste it into here. We'll save it, we'll go back and refresh, and now it looks right. So we did have to copy one style over, but now there's a whole bunch of styles that we can remove because we're no longer overriding styles that we set for the heading. So for example, we can remove text align left. We can remove text transform since by default it's not going to uppercase everything. We'll keep the font size, we'll keep the font weight. The color is still the same. Letter spacing we were overriding, so we can remove that. Border we were overriding, so we can remove that. And padding and margin as well, so we can remove that. Now if we save this and go back to the browser and refresh, we now have the default h2 styles that the browser comes with being applied to this heading, and nothing else except what we want to override. Now eventually we may want to play with the margin and padding a little bit, but for now this is good. And it's much easier to understand what we're trying to do in our CSS. So let's compare this briefly with what we had before. I'll create a new file, and I'll undo our changes so we can compare with our latest version here. So here's our latest version, and here's our old version. As you can see, the latest version is a bit smaller, and it's also a ton more descriptive. So here we have an h2 heading, but we don't know exactly where these h2 headings are being used or what their meaning is. Is this all h2 headings? In our case, it's probably not going to be all of our h2 headings. So in this side, it's a lot more clear that we're styling a stacked hero section title. The class name is very semantic. It has a lot of meaning. Also down here, the h2, we know it's a heading, but what level of heading is it in this section? On this side, we know it's the title, which means that in a hierarchy of headings, this one is going to be at the very top. And then finally, we would have the same question about this h2 in the slide, which is what role does it have? And over here, because we're using a semantic class, we know exactly what role it has. It's the title. And probably most importantly, because we're not doing any overriding of our own styles, we now know that all of these styles are additive. That is, they combine with the previous styles, instead of being subtractive. When something is subtractive, like over here our padding, margin, letter spacing, and so on, then these styles are directly tied to another selector. If this selector changes, so for example, let's say we remove the margin, then all of a sudden we have an extra property definition down here that we don't need anymore. By being additive over here, we ensure that we're not going to end up with legacy properties that aren't being used anymore. And one final thing to demonstrate, I'm going to reorganize this for a moment, is that we've also decoupled our HTML structure from the styles that we use. So we're now free to restructure our HTML if we decide that a different structure is going to make more sense. So for example, we could change this heading to an H1 or an H3, and our styles will remain at least mostly the same. Let's give it a try. I'm going to change this to an H1. I'll change the closing tag here, and I'll save it. And jump back to the browser and refresh, and you see that the heading didn't change at all. Having this freedom to adjust our HTML means that we'll stand a better chance of creating meaningful structures in our HTML, because we won't have to feel like we're going to inadvertently mess up our CSS and possibly end up with CSS definitions that we no longer use. If we decided to change this to an h1 tag, for example, and we were using an h2 tag for the selector, then immediately we would see all of our styles be removed from the heading. If we have a super long CSS file, which is kind of inevitable in some of your initial projects, then you might end up just adding new styles at the very bottom of the CSS file to work with the h1 class. And then we end up with some CSS that we're never going to use again for h2 tags inside of slide sections. Okay, now just stepping back, this was a lot of information. There's a lot of variables that are coming into play with why we're using these class names instead of HTML element selectors directly. Some of this might not make sense right away, but hopefully we've planted the seed so that as you work with more and more complicated projects, you can start to identify problematic patterns and see that this is a solution that works.